Well, for tonight, we wanted to have kind of a broad conversation about how there are so many things that we just sort of assume or take for fact about gender and sexuality and sex and all these different pieces that are actually just culture. And I wanted to dive into that a little bit. And I'd like to think that, over the past 3.5 years, we've done a lot to answer this question. But Laura, for the sake of our conversation here, how should we define sexuality?
Oh, okay. So that's interesting because people will think different things when they say sexuality. It could be sex as in gender or what their body parts are. It could also be what what type of person they're attracted to. But interestingly, when I was doing some pre-research, it also talks about behaviors like sexual behaviors, whether or not
Hmm.
premarital sex is accepted or unaccepted. So the term sexuality is super broad, right? And when I tend to hear it like, hey, what's your sexuality? I think of like sexual orientation, like what types of people are you attracted to? But in fact, it could mean any number of things, like how what your views are culturally on what's acceptable or unacceptable with sex. So sexuality being more open or more closed or more traditional or more liberal, right? Um, so it's definitely got a broad meaning to it that hopefully tonight we'll be able to kind of zone in on a little bit.
Yeah, so it's really covering. I mean, this is a very broad term, I guess, that covers really everything that we like to get into on this show. And I suppose then that is distinct from this idea of gender.
Sexuality and gender being two different things.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, but that's even more interesting because um not just sexuality, but the term sex and gender. So when you say like their sex is male or female and their gender is male or female, now you're saying two different things. Whereas in the past those two terms were sort of married together or interchangeable. Now we're
Hmm.
noticing that well, A, sex is not so cut and dry, right? Whether you're male or female. There's a lot of gray area that I hope we get into tonight. But that those two terms need to be distinct because there are distinctions between someone's biological sex and then a culture's views on what their gender is, which is like the roles that they would play in a culture.
Yeah, and we've got so much to cover here, and I'll be really curious to see where we actually end up. But I'll go ahead and acknowledge for myself that for a good while of my early education, I sort of understood that okay, our gender is more than just our body parts. Our gender is our personal
Mhm.
experience and these kinds of things. But maybe sex is that thing that's sort of immutable. That's the thing that's genetic. So even at that stage of my life, I was willing to embrace, like, oh, okay, you're transgender, but your sex is still discreetly XX or XY. And I just want to say to anybody who is maybe still operating from that place, I see you. I definitely sure as shit don't judge you, but you got some learning to
You're
do.
wrong. Yeah.
That idea was beaten out of my head well before I was able to sit in this chair. And I'm, sitting in this chair in large part to help remind people of that fact. So I'm sure we'll be breaking down some of those kinds of things, but I want to just take a really quick moment to recognize that sex is a lot more complicated than just chromosomes. And that's certainly something we've said on this show before, but it bears repeating because it is a very common cultural myth that frankly ends lives, that has like very dire
Absolutely.
real world consequences.
Well, I think that there still is sort of that mentality out there that your sex is how you present physically. And so you're already at the chromosome level, which is way beyond that conversation. But there's still so many people out there that are like, well, if you have a penis, you're a boy, and if you have a vulva or vagina, you're a female. And there's so much wrong with that. But I know that a lot of people, when they're talking to those types of people and the trans activists, when they're talking to those types of people, will say things like, well, when you see a woman walking down the street, do you know she has a vagina? Like, have you seen it? Right? So
Sure.
there's already like this, we make a lot of cultural assumptions based on how someone appears or how they look without actually knowing. But then you took it even just a step further right off the bat and like we don't even know chromosomally what a person may or may not be.
Yeah, yeah, no, just to simplify it a whole hell of a lot. If you are walking around thinking that all 7.5 billion people on this planet can be discreetly separated into a XX category or a XY category, you are very far off the mark. And we're not just talking about so-called genetic abnormalities or mutations. Certainly there is a lot to be discussed there. That's maybe a more biologically, genetically, scientifically oriented conversation than the one that we wanted to have tonight. But that feels like a very important thing to just stress at this day and age. That
It's
being
also
said,
funny how it's
mhm,
sorry, Chrissy. It's just funny how most of the people who are insisting that you're either XX or XY suddenly become geneticists when they are completely unaware of things like, like Klinefelter's or super male syndrome or
right.
XXYY or any of the other. It's like you're not even aware of the anomalies, and yet you're willing to you. So I just wanted to point that out before you move on.
No, it's really worth saying. But if we are broadly speaking about gender in terms of usually more or less falling into kind of two broad categories, how universal is that framework cross culturally?
It's not, to answer it shortly. Um, so gender is pretty significantly different in every culture, even amongst those cultures that have the binary of like here's this male and then female. Even within those cultures, there's a lot of variation, and sort of like I would say like the way that they practice things, the way that that their definitions of what a male or female is change. But there are many, 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 many cultures that have more than one gender, and I wish I remembered the name of it. There was one that I studied, a few years back that had seven distinct genders, and they boil the genders down more by what role a person plays in society, more so than their physical sex traits, right? So they were very loose about what that gender was. But there are a lot of cultures today that recognize third and fourth genders, which I think is still a bit too limiting when you think about it.
Sure.
But yeah, but the two that came to mind that are relatively well known that people in the audience may have already heard of, are the two spirits of the Native Americans,
Mhm.
which is just recognizing that there are males out there that present more as female or identify more as female. Um, and so that I find a little bit more limiting because now you're talking about a third demographic, but there's still more out there to be done. So recognizing a third gender is fantastic. But it's like one more box instead of opening up the whole range and the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
And there's something similar in Mexico. It's pronounced Muxe, but it's spelled Muxes. So those are men. If you were to see a picture of one today, you might identify them as being like a queen, but they're not. There's a lot of differences. So they're males that identify as homosexual and prefer to dress as women. So they are sort of a blend of some of our different concepts of well, we have gay and we have transgender and we have say queens who prefer to dress that way but don't necessarily have any other physical traits that are female, right? And they sort of blend it together into one label. Um, so it's interesting because I mean those are just two examples, but those are cultures that already readily accept that there are different expressions of gender and they celebrate those. So the Mushe in Mexico are they're really celebrated within their cultures.
Which is, I think, a important thing to highlight about this whole discussion. It's not that we're necessarily like scanning the globe and all of history, trying to like
Right.
cherry pick little examples of people who maybe believed what we want the world to believe. Like we're not trying to push some kind of agenda. What we're trying to reflect here is the reality that so many of us just assume that these things are biological, hard and fast realities when they're
Mhm.
just not. They're constructed. They are just assumptions that we make because that's what we were taught, and because that's what our parents were taught, and that's because everybody in our culture, everybody around us was taught these things. And come to find out, when you teach people different things in different parts of the world, you get different experiences, even though our
Absolutely.
genetics
Yeah.
are largely the same.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that
it's funny that you say not to cherry pick and stuff because in preparation for the show, I made just a really quick list of I don't know, maybe a dozen or so different cultures that just have different genders, like more than just the binary gender. And you're right, it's very easy to be like, well, it's that culture or that culture. But the idea I think to highlight that's the most important is that there is no strict definition and that it all
Hmm.
comes down to what people are taught early on is or isn't acceptable, more so than what's biologically natural.
yeah, it strikes me too whenever I hear of these culturally accepted, third or other genders, is that in
Mhm.
my experience from what I've heard, and maybe you can comment on this, Laura, but it's almost always not Christian ones. Like
Yeah.
it's indigenous cultures or,
Yeah.
Colonialism has a big part to play here. I'll,
Yeah.
I'll let you two weigh
Exactly.
in on
I
that,
was
but
gonna
yeah.
bring that up, yeah, and there are even cultures that they've, shown that in the past they had multiple genders or a looser definition of, genders or even, sexuality, like, what they see as appropriate sexual behaviors. Once they're exposed to colonialism, they can see historically where those rules start to tighten up a little bit and those things start to change. So there are cultures that once accepted third genders that don't anymore, or that once were more
Yeah.
maybe sexually liberated and aren't anymore. And I thought India was a really really good example of this. Like historically, they were a very sexually liberated nation, and then colonialism came in and really squelched that. So they had to go through similar to what we're going through now, sort of a sexual what do you call it, like liberation again, where they sort of regain their sexual identity.
Yeah.
Well, they've
And,
got
to
big shoes to fill with the Kama Sutra. Go ahead,
yeah.
Christy.
And I was gonna, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, this notion that we are just cherry picking is something, is a criticism that's been maybe leveled at this show before, because we talked to Billy Beard about non-binary historical figures, and some other things. Like, we've tried to maybe fill in like the cultural record in our own little way, and it can seem like a bit of whataboutism. Like, in this giant planet full of all these people, well, okay, so this one tribe this one time had this weird little belief. But I think you have to recognize that there has been a intentional campaign waged for
Mhm.
thousands of years to delete so much of this from the historical record. I mean, Laura, you
Exactly.
talked about two spirits in Native American cultures. Let's acknowledge that the phrase Native American cultures is a very like
It's
colonialist
problematic.
perspective. I mean, I'm
It's
not
super
calling you out
problematic,
on it. I'm
yeah.
just saying that we have done
Yeah.
so much to destroy those cultures that the remnants that remain don't have the distinctness and
Right.
the I guess historical backing to maybe discuss these things in more detailed ways.
No, you're right, and that's something that is really, really good to point out to the audience too, is like when you say Native American, it's a lot like saying European, right? Where there's a lot of different cultures and backgrounds and histories and ways of doing things that get kind of lumped in, that maybe should be distinct. And one thing about the two spirits too is that when you say, "Oh, it's a Native American term," it's not. It's a term among some Native American tribes, right? Others have different words for it, and some, just like any other demographic area where you have multiple tribes, you're going to have some that accept and some that don't. So it's sort of a blanket statement when we say the Native Americans have the two spirit. And
Hmm.
what's interesting about that too is that term was developed in the 1950s, I believe, when they needed a way of identifying a third gender. So it's not like that specific term has been around for thousands of years. Not that they haven't accepted a third gender, but that term, two spirits, is relatively new.
We're viewing these other cultures through a specific lens, which is,
Mhm.
somewhat inevitable. And I don't want to say okay, but like, it's the tool that we have to work with, and that's all right. But it's just a another reminder that everything that we see is through a lens. And if you're not willing to take your glasses off and wipe them down a little bit every once in a while, you can start to get tunnel vision, and you can start to believe all of the bullshit that you might hear in the news about trans athletes competing at the high school level, and some of these silly notions can get really carried further than they really deserve.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's hard to hear with your head buried in the sand.
Yeah, fair to say. Laura, you mentioned that even like 3 or 7 or 12 genders that are expressed in certain cultures might be too limiting. And I've gotten a little bit of flack for it, but I don't apologize for saying on this show that I really believe that there are like 7.5 billion genders, that really
Yeah.
everybody has sort of their own, and that it's tricky to be discussing these things. So we try to come up with as much language as we can. We have shows like this where, I think we could be accused of sort of just staring at our navels too much and overthinking these very simple things. But the reality is, human diversity is a beautiful aspect of our species. And there have been some really aggressive forces, i.e., religious forces in particular, to kind of stomp all that out.
Yeah, religious and political, because sometimes, like, I know I see religion as sort of a cultural tool. I don't see it as its own beast, right? And so,
Sure.
I think religion is definitely one of the most popular scapegoats. But I think even just political tools are often put in place to limit our diversity and our behavior and our expression of uniqueness. But yeah, when you said the 7.8 billion different genders, I could not agree more. I think so. One of the things that makes us unique as humans is our way of labeling and categorizing everything, right? Like we are analyzers, and so we need our little boxes and our labels for everything. And I really think that there's going to come a point, or hopefully there'll come a point where that becomes antiquated, where it's less about what you call a thing and more about how you understand it, right? Like I agree with you. We need labels to communicate, to use words, like to put in a sentence. I know at one point someone had, in a podcast I was listening to, they had said that the term pan, it does a disservice to bisexuals, right? Because a bisexual can still be attracted to a trans person. And my pushback to that would be, if we have words that give as much information as possible in as little amount of words as possible, let's take it and run with it and use it, right? Because that it conveys information without having to say, well, I'm attracted to these people sometimes and that people and sometimes that person. It's a blanket statement that conveys a lot of information quickly, but then it becomes limited. I mean, it has its pluses and minuses. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, for years, I would be able to count on V, my former co-host, to step in here and talk about the difference between descriptive language and prescriptive language. And I,
I
I
love
really
that.
appreciate that distinction, because I think it's really useful in a conversation like this. When I tell somebody that I'm a man, I'm not like signing up for things that men do. I don't even necessarily know that that would be the right label for me, but I use it because I can describe myself. And when I tell somebody that I'm a
Mhm.
man, they create a picture in their head that lines up sufficiently with what I am. So it's not that I am being prescribed like this is manliness and this is what I am
Mm.
signing up for and this is what I'm committed to and this is me. It's more just this is me and this is the word that I'm using so that you can get some notion of the idea that I'm looking to express.
I
So
think you
what you're
bring up a really
saying
good
is you don't
point.
own a Jeep?
I
Is that
do
what I'm
not
hearing?
own a single
Okay.
Jeep.
Okay. Okay. I like what
I
you
have
guys are
no
saying
Metallica
with,
CDs. It's not, yeah.
oh, well, I'll let that one go for now. The way that I've explained it to folks is kind of like a number line. Like there isn't just 0 and 1. There's actually an infinite amount of numbers between 0 and 1. You go 0.112, 0.115. It's kind of like it's like a dimmer switch, right? It's
Mhm.
not 0 or 1. There's so many different possibilities between those two ends. And we don't even know if it does end, to be honest. So
Sure.
I like the way you guys explain that.
I
Yeah.
like that. I
Well,
was I was watching. Oh, good.
no, Laura, I'd love to get your final thoughts. And then there was something I wanted to address before I let Nate jump on the phones.
Well, I was just gonna say briefly, and I don't even know if it needs to be said after everything that you guys said, but he said number line, and I was watching a video on
Mhm.
autism the other day where they showed the spectrum as not being a straight line, but they showed kind of a color wheel, and so it
Mm-hmm.
had like the
Mm.
colors blurring as a rainbow, and I really liked that analogy better because it's like in different ways you fall in different parts. So you may have like different dots along that color spectrum, rather than being like here's my one dot on the line where here's where my gender exists, right? And I think the more that we can see sex and gender, and sexuality as being sort of this color wheel, I think we'll understand it a lot better and be more accepting of other people when they don't fall exactly where we think that they're going to fall.
Yeah, and I love that neurodiversity piece. I love that neurodiversity is being much better understood than it has in the
Mhm.
past. That's certainly something we've tried to chronicle on this show. But I guess I want to remind people that it just makes sense if you think about it. I think it could be really easy for somebody to come in and say, like, well, when I was a kid, we just had men's and we had women's and we had boys and we had girls, and those were the four you needed to know.
We
And
also
I,
had
I
polio.
yeah, we also have polio.
We also have people who were suicidal and had to fit into like
Well,
pockets that they don't belong in.
yeah, but I mean, it makes sense as we begin to understand these things in more details. Like when you are teaching a 4-year-old about numbers, you're not getting into irrational numbers. You're not getting into like the 10th
Yes.
decimal place. You
Brilliant.
have
Yes.
distinct boxes, right? So male and female, 2 boxes. That's simple and it makes sense. And then we developed a spectrum and we said, oh, well, actually, there are all these like continuous little dots in between. And now maybe this color wheel notion makes better sense. That's just how we develop as a society, as we learn how to defeat polio and as we learn how to like understand the genetic codes and these things. It's natural that our understanding will get more sophisticated. And yeah, we're still scratching around the edges of the darkness with, sticks that are on fire. Like, I don't want to pretend that we have all of this figured out, but we know more than we did. And that's why we're saying things that are different than what we used to say. It's not because human genetics have changed. I mean, those have been evolving for millions of years, but we've only begun to start looking at them in any meaningful way recently. Which, to that end, Nate, I said I wanted you to jump on the phones when we can, but I wanted to just quickly address something I saw in the chat. I don't want to get too far afield, and I don't want to overly conflate sex and gender. Just very, very simply, your gender is sort of this outward expression of who you are. Your sex is much more related to your medical or your biological or your genetic identity. But even then, your sex, like we said, is not XX or XY. It's more convoluted than that. And there was a question in the chat. What if somebody wants to point out that the anomalies shouldn't be part of the discussion? And I think the notion here is that if we are talking about just sort of the general way that people present, maybe we should say like, okay, some of these like very rare exceptions are outside of the norm and we should sort of silo those into a different category and maybe dismiss trans identities and these things as perhaps like genetic anomalies or things like that. And that might be an interesting line of inquiry if it at all lined up with what we understand of the science, which is that, again, XX and XY are way too simplistic. I'm not a geneticist, and I don't want to carry on for a conversation that we've had with actual experts on this show. And you can go back through our old episodes and you can see that explained much more competently than I ever could. But I really want to stress that your genetic code is so much more complicated than those two distinctions. And it's worth acknowledging that, yes, Klinefelter syndrome and triple X and Fragile Y and these different things, they might be sort of rare genetic anomalies, but there's so much more that goes into both sex and gender than just that one chromosomal pair. So
Mhm.
if you are still confused about these issues, that's okay. They're very confusing, but be mindful not to spread misinformation or to buy into a bunch of bullshit. We have done our very best to try and document these ideas on this show. I will make sure to have in the show notes for this episode much more detailed scientific examinations of how the biological sex idea is something of a rounding error. And I would just beg you to work to inform yourself about some of these things.
Yeah, and if I
That
could
rant
maybe
over.
just
Yeah, go ahead.
if I could just maybe add to that rant before we move on, like, it doesn't matter to me whether 1 in 50 people in trans or whether 1 in 50,000 people has Klinefelter syndrome. The amount of people that have it is irrelevant. We're not looking to exclude people. We're specifically working towards inclusivity. And if your argument is that, well, if we ignore everyone that doesn't fit the mold, well, then yeah, I'm right. 0 and 1, male or female. Like that's such a ridiculous argument.
And yet.
Anyways.
And yet.